The Dragon's Merchant of Death. Act 1, The Weight of Gold. Chapters 1 through V. Chapter 1, Inventory. The Price of Everything. The manifests never lied. That was the first rule Issei Hyoudou had written for himself in the early months of his new existence, scratched into the back page of a leather-bound ledger with a borrowed pen while sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor of a gremmery storage vault. Other people lied. Feelings lied. Memory, most treacherously of all, lied. But a line item in a properly maintained inventory was incapable of deception. It either balanced or it did not. This particular manifest ran to 63 pages. It covered the contents of Warehouse 7, which was technically still listed under the administrative ownership of the Phoenix clan as a legacy tax shelter from a commercial dispute settled 4 centuries ago. That dispute was now meaningless. The humans who had argued over it were ash. The clan members who had signed the original documents had been reincarnated twice over, but the warehouse still existed, and the manifest said it contained, among other things, 4 crates of crystallized phoenix tears in pharmaceutical grade, 2 pallets of Leviathan-scale composite armor plating intended for a devil infantry contract that had never been fulfilled, 112 enchanted weapons of varying lineage and lethality, and a locked chest in the northeast corner whose contents were catalogued only as Item 77, Provenance Unknown, Acquisition Cost 0. Estimated Resale Value Under Review. Issei crossed the warehouse floor with his hands in his coat pockets, his footsteps echoing off walls that had not been cleaned since the previous century. He was 19 years old by the accounting of his devil body, though his soul remembered a different age entirely. He had been a second-year high school student once, in a life that felt like someone else's dream. He had carried a sacred gear that contained a being of enormous power, and had been surrounded by remarkable women, and had faced enemies of world-ending ambition, and through all of it he had been, fundamentally, a passenger. Enthusiastic. Loyal. Brave enough when it mattered. But a passenger. He was not a passenger anymore. He stopped in front of Item 77 and crouched down. The chest was iron-banded oak, roughly the size of a large suitcase, and it hummed with a faint resonance that most people would have dismissed as the echo of ambient magical interference from the surrounding crates. Issei did not dismiss it. He had learned to treat the things he did not yet understand as potential assets rather than inconveniences. Boosted gear, he said quietly, not to summon the gauntlet but simply to invite the commentary of the presence inside it. A voice answered, warm and ancient and faintly amused. That chest is holding something alive, Drake said. Not alive in the conventional sense. Something that was alive and chose to compress itself into a state of extreme patience. A long time ago. How long? Longer than me, Drake said, and he did not add anything else because that was already enough to communicate the relevant scale of the situation. Issei looked at the chest for a long moment. Then he picked up his stylus, opened the manifest to page 41, and changed Item 77's status from under review to priority asset, pending classification. He drew a small star next to the entry, which was his private notation for things that would one day change the shape of a negotiation he had not yet imagined. He had a lot of starred items. He stood up, rolled his shoulders, and walked to the warehouse's single cracked window. Outside, the underworld spread across its impossible geography, the bruised amber of the lower sky, the slow pulse of magical infrastructure carrying energy from the great furnaces of the noble territories into the veins of the common districts, the distant towers of Lucifer's administrative complex rising like a crown the previous owner no longer wore. It was a civilization of enormous power and remarkably poor resource management, and Issei had been studying its inefficiencies with the focused attention of a student who understood that someone was going to profit from every gap in the system. He intended it to be him. A brief history of the current situation. The situation, condensed to its essential shape, was this. Issei Hyoudou had died and been reincarnated as a devil under Rias Gremry, had served her peerage with distinction through several crises of escalating consequence, had developed the boosted gear to a degree that surprised nearly everyone including Drake, and had ultimately survived circumstances that should have killed him multiple times. None of that was the interesting part. The interesting part was the conversation he had overheard in the corridor outside the Gremry family's primary accountant's office approximately 16 months ago, When he had been waiting to submit an expense report for equipment damaged during a training exercise and had instead listened to two of the most senior financial administrators in the Gremery household argue in increasingly agitated voices about a structural deficit in the clan's mid-tier trade routes that they had been concealing from Lord Gremery with creative categorization for the past 11 years, Issei had submitted his expense report. He had gone home. He had sat at his desk with a blank notebook, and, for the first time in his life, had applied the same systematic focus he gave to combat training to the question of how money actually moved through the underworld. 3 months later he had a notebook that was no longer blank. He had, through careful observation and a series of conversations he had engineered to seem accidental, mapped the primary and secondary trade corridors between 7 noble territories, identified 4 recurring supply shortages that none of the responsible parties had bothered to solve because solving them would have required acknowledging their existence, and located 11 warehouses in various states of administrative limbo whose contents were theoretically owned by entities that had not checked on them in decades. He had gone to Rias. She had listened with the patient attention she always gave him, her fingers laced together on the surface of her desk, her crimson hair falling across her shoulder. When he was done, she had been quiet for a moment. "You want to become a merchant," she had said, in the tone of someone trying to locate the most accurate word for a concept that surprised them. "I want to build something," he had said. "I want to build something that makes us more important in 5 years than we are now, not because of how hard we can hit, but because of what happens to the underworld's supply chains if we decide to stop working." Another silence. Then she had smiled, slow and considering. "What do you need from me?" He had needed 3 things. He had needed the legal standing that came with formal Gremery patronage. He had needed access to the family's historical trade records going back 4 centuries. And he had needed a letter of administrative inquiry that would give him the right to inspect the contents of 11 warehouses in administrative limbo without triggering the legal tripwires that would notify their nominal owners. Rias had given him all 3 within a week. And she had also given him something he had not asked for, which was a quiet word to her brother Surzex, which meant that the letter of inquiry arrived with an unofficial but unmistakable weight of authority behind it that most administrators would not have dared to question. That had been 16 months ago. The warehouses were now his. The supply routes were now mapped. The shortages were now opportunities. And Issei Hyoudou, former high school student, former bishop, former power fantasy of a teenage boy who had wanted very badly to be noticed, was standing in Warehouse 7 at 3 in the morning reading a manifest and making stars next to the things that were going to change the world. The first real meeting. He met Rainier again on a Tuesday. It was not, technically speaking, the original Rainier. The original Rainier was dead, by his hand, in a life and a world that had since reconfigured itself in ways that still occasionally gave him a cold feeling in the center of his chest when he thought about it too directly. This Rainier was a reconstruction, or perhaps a parallel, the philosophical question of her exact ontological status being one he had decided early on was not productive to engage with. She was here. She was Rainier. She had approximately the same face and bearing and aggressive competence. And she had shown up at the door of his co-office 3 months ago with a folder of intelligence documents, and an expression that dared him to make it strange. He had not made it strange. He had looked at the documents, asked for clarifying questions, offered a contract rate that was 15% above the standard mercenary scale for information brokers, and shaken her hand. She had, visibly, not known how to process this. "You know who I am," she had said. Not a question. "I know who you were," he had answered. "That's different." She had stared at him for a long moment, reading something in his face that she apparently found more complicated than she had expected. Then she had pocketed the contract and left, and the next morning a second installment of intelligence documents had appeared on his desk, these ones covering the private trade arrangements of 3 minor noble families in the lower underworld territories, and they were exactly as useful as she had clearly known they would be. That had been 3 months ago. She was now, by any reasonable accounting, his most valuable information asset, a fact she was absolutely aware of and which she used as leverage in their regular contract renegotiations with a professional precision he found genuinely admirable. She was waiting for him when he returned from Warehouse 7, sitting in the chair across from his desk with her legs crossed and a coffee cup balanced on her knee, reading a report with the focused attention of someone who had learned that the difference between actionable intelligence and background noise was in the details. Item 77, she said, without looking up. You've been in my manifests. You left them on your desk. I needed the Phoenix Storage Index. I keep the Phoenix Index in a locked drawer. She looked up and met his eyes. I know. He took off his coat and hung it by the door. What do you know about item 77? I know it was in a sealed section of the warehouse that technically predates the Phoenix clan's ownership, which means it was in there before the Phoenix Vault was ever built around it. I know that the original construction permits for that warehouse were filed under a company name that dissolves into 6 shell entities before you get to an actual owner. And I know, she said, setting down the report with deliberate care, that 3 different parties have independently sent quiet inquiries about the contents of that specific warehouse in the last 8 months. One of them is a mid-tier collector of unusual artifacts with no political affiliation. One of them is a front organization for the Chaos Brigade. And one of them is the administrative office of the current Satan Leviathan. Issei sat down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was a habit he had when he was processing information that was more significant than he had anticipated. Leviathan's office, he said. Sarah Fall, Rainier confirmed. Or someone acting on her behalf. The inquiry was made through 4 intermediaries, but the trail isn't as clean as whoever filed it seems to think it is. He thought about that. Then he thought about the chest and the sound it made, and what Drake had said about the length of time it had been patient. We're not selling item 77, he said. Not to anyone. Not yet. Get me everything you can find on what was built into that warehouse before the Phoenix took it over. That's going to require a research contractor with specific historical access, she said. It won't be cheap. Invoice it to the Raider account. She made a note. Then, after a pause that had a slightly different quality than her usual professional silences, you're not worried? About Leviathan's interest in a chest in one of my warehouses? About any of it? The scale of what you're building? The people you're going to attract? The fact that you're apparently in possession of something that the Chaos Brigade wants and a current Satan is curious about? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stack of manifests on his desk. Then he looked at her. I'm building something that has value to everyone, he said. That's the protection. If I'm just someone with a powerful arm, I'm a threat. If I'm the person who keeps the supply chains running and solves the shortages that everyone agrees are someone else's problem, I'm infrastructure. And no one blows up their own infrastructure. That assumes everyone is rational, she said. It assumes, he said, that everyone is rational about the things they can't afford to lose. That's a smaller and more reliable category. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her report and resumed reading. Invoice to the Raider account, she confirmed, and the conversation ended the way most of his conversations with her ended, which was not with resolution but with the clear understanding that work had begun. Chapter 2, The Goblin Syndicate. Supply and Demand in the Lower Districts. The lower districts of the Underworld had a reputation that their residents had long since stopped bothering to dispute. They were overcrowded, underserviced, and governed by a patchwork of informal authorities that ranged from neighborhood associations with genuine community investment to protection enterprises that offered safety from the very dangers their operators quietly maintained. They were also, Issei had determined within his first month of serious economic study, the most important commercial territory in the entire Underworld. Not because of what they produced, though what they produced was substantial. Not because of what they consumed, though what they consumed kept the noble territory's secondary markets alive. But because of what they moved. Everything passed through the lower districts eventually. The noble families shipped through them because the formal transport infrastructure was too slow and too visible for anything they preferred not to document. The independent operators shipped through them because there was no alternative. The contraband trade, the gray market enchantments, the off-book weapons contracts, the informal exchange of information that was the Underworld's true circulatory system, all of it moved through the lower districts like blood through capillaries, and the people who controlled those capillaries were not the noble families and not the Satans and not the political entities whose names appeared in official histories. They were the goblins. The Goblin Syndicate did not call itself the Goblin Syndicate. It called itself the Lower District Mutual Commerce Association, which was the kind of name that functioned as camouflage by being too boring to investigate. It had operated for approximately 3 centuries under a succession of leadership structures that adapted themselves to whatever political environment happened to be current, and it controlled, by Issei's conservative estimate, roughly 40% of all informal freight movement in the 12 sectors of the lower underworld. He had requested a meeting through 3 intermediaries and had been waiting 2 weeks for a response when the response arrived, which was a small green card slipped under his office door at some point during the night with an address and a time and the single word, "Fine." He went alone. Rainier had objected to this with precisely the level of professional intensity he had expected, and he had listened to her objections with the full attention they deserved before explaining his reasoning, which was that arriving with security communicated threat assessment, and he did not want this meeting to begin with the other party conducting threat assessment. He wanted it to begin with them conducting curiosity assessment, and if they decide that eliminating you is more commercially interesting than meeting with you? She had asked. Then I've misjudged the situation, he had said, and I should learn from that. She had stared at him. That is not a reassuring answer. It's the honest one. The address was a warehouse in Sector 9, which was the kind of location that communicated several things simultaneously, that the meeting was important enough to warrant a secure venue, that the secure venue was chosen to be on their terrain and not his, and that whoever had selected the location knew that he was smart enough to understand both of those things. He appreciated the layered communication. It meant he was dealing with people who thought in multiple registers. There were 7 of them waiting inside the warehouse. Goblins in the underworld were nothing like the small, hunched creatures of human folklore. They ranged in height from around 5 feet to just over 6, with the dense, compact muscle structure of a species that had evolved under conditions of constant physical competition and the sharp, asymmetrical features that gave them a permanent expression of calculating appraisal. They wore clothes that were practical without being shabby and expensive without being ostentatious, which told him immediately that these were not street-level operators but organizational leadership. The one who sat at the single table in the center of the warehouse was a woman who appeared to be in her early middle age by goblin reckoning, though he knew that could represent anywhere from 1 to 4 centuries. Her name, according to Rainier's research, was Vrac. She was the 4th director of the Mutual Commerce Association in the past 80 years and by most accounts the most effective. She had reorganized the freight logistics twice, survived a hostile annexation attempt by a mid-tier noble family, and apparently once settled a territorial dispute with a rival organization by buying the rival organization's debt, and then restructuring it so comprehensively that the rival organization had essentially dissolved into hers over the course of 2 years without a single violent incident. He liked her already. Issei Hyoudou, she said. Not a greeting. An identification. Director Vrac, he said. You want a logistics contract. I want a partnership, he said. The logistics contract is the mechanism. The partnership is the substance. She watched him with the flat evaluative attention of someone who had heard a great many people describe what they wanted while actually wanting something else. Explain the difference. He had thought carefully about how to say this. He had practiced several versions and discarded them in favor of the direct approach, which was appropriate because she was clearly someone who would notice the gap between what he was saying and what he meant if there was one. A logistics contract means I hire you to move goods and you do it, and we negotiate terms periodically, and the relationship is transactional. A partnership means that when I identify a shortage in a sector, I bring it to you before I bring it to anyone else. It means that when you identify a route that's being underutilized, you bring it to me. It means that we share information about who's trying to disrupt what, because disruption affects us both. It means that when I expand, you expand with me, and when you need capital access that's beyond your current structure, I'm the first call you make. She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, one of the other goblins, a younger one with quick eyes, was writing something down. You're 19 years old, she said. By devil reckoning, yes. You have Gremry patronage, but you operate independently. Gremry provides legal standing. The operation is mine. You're sitting in a warehouse in Sector 9 without a guard, offering a partnership to an organization that has made 3 people disappear in the past year for substantially less provocation than you've given us. He looked at her steadily. You didn't make those people disappear because they provoked you. You made them disappear because they were trying to undercut you and they weren't smart enough to offer you something valuable in return. I'm not undercutting you. And I'm offering you something valuable. Another silence. This one had a different quality. What specifically, she said, are you offering? He reached into his coat and set a folder on the table. It contained a single document, a 40-page analysis of the freight bottleneck in the eastern corridor of Sector 11, including the exact location of 3 redundant transit points that were slowing delivery times by an average of 18%. The names of the 4 administrative officials who were maintaining the bottleneck because they received informal payments from the single operator currently exploiting the slowdown, and a proposed restructuring of the corridor's routing architecture that would increase throughput by roughly a third while simultaneously eliminating the leverage those 4 officials currently held. She picked up the document. She read the first 3 pages with no change in her expression. Then she read the next 3 pages a little more slowly. Then she set it down. You did this analysis yourself? My team did the data collection. I did the analysis. She looked at the folder for a moment. Then she looked at him. The operator maintaining the bottleneck. Do you know who he answers to? Marchioness Glagia Labelas, at 2 removes. And you're not concerned about her reaction if we restructure her operator's arrangement. He had thought about this. Her arrangement depends on the bottleneck. If we eliminate the bottleneck, her arrangement generates the same revenue it always did through formal channel fees instead of informal ones. She loses the leverage but gains the legitimacy, and I'm told she's in a period of political exposure where legitimacy is currently more valuable to her than leverage. If I'm wrong about that, I'll manage the consequence. But I don't think I'm wrong. Vrak looked at the document again. Then she looked at the young goblin with the quick eyes, who nodded almost imperceptibly. We'll review the full analysis, she said. Give us 3 days. Of course. He stood to leave. He had reached the warehouse door when she spoke again. The Gremory girl know you're building something this size? He paused. He turned back. She knows I'm building something. She understands the size well enough. She chose to give me room to build it. Vrak made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Interesting girl. She's remarkable, he said, and meant it entirely, and left the warehouse. 3 days later, the Mutual Commerce Association sent him a counter-proposal. It was thorough, professionally structured, and included 17 amendments to the partnership terms he had proposed, of which he accepted 15 immediately, negotiated 1, and declined 1 on grounds that he explained in writing with a specificity that communicated he had anticipated that particular counter-proposal and thought carefully about whether to accept it. The declined amendment was reinstated in a modified form a week later. The contract was signed the following afternoon. The Goblin Syndicate was his first real ally. He did not intend it to be his last. Chapter 3, The Arsenal. Weapons have no politics. The thing about forbidden artifacts was that they were rarely forbidden because they were dangerous. Most things that were genuinely dangerous had powerful interested parties who ensured they remained commercially available. The artifacts that ended up classified as forbidden were usually forbidden because they were inconvenient, because their existence documented something a ruling power preferred to be undocumented, because they operated on a logic that did not align with the current theoretical framework of approved magical research, or because they had been forbidden so long ago and for reasons so thoroughly bureaucratized that no one currently alive remembered the original justification and no one had the administrative motivation to revisit it. This did not make them harmless. But it meant that harmlessness and prohibition were not the same variable, and Issei had built his entire acquisition strategy around the gap between them. He had met Eubelina 9 months ago in circumstances that he still occasionally found slightly surreal in retrospect. She had shown up at a weapons auction in the mid-tier commercial district, attended by approximately 40 buyers ranging from legitimate noble representatives to individuals who clearly preferred not to be named in the auction house's records. Issei had been there as a legitimate buyer under his own name, which was itself unusual enough to generate sideways looks. He had been interested in a lot of 17 assorted enchanted projectile weapons from a dissolved mercenary company, the value of which was primarily in the enchantment matrices rather than the physical materials. Eubelina had been there as a seller. More specifically, she had been there because a consignment she had arranged to sell through the auction house had been flagged by the house's authentication process, and she was arguing, in the controlled but intense way of someone accustomed to winning arguments by force of precision, with the authentication officer about the flagging criteria. Issei had listened to the argument for approximately 4 minutes before he understood what was being discussed, which was a consignment of 11 items from the archives of the Phoenix family's secondary research branch, which had been dissolved 60 years ago during a period of political restructuring. The authentication officer's position was that items from a dissolved noble family's private research archive could not be sold without verification of clear title from the successor entity. Eubelina's position was that the Phoenix family's successor entity did not exist because the family itself had been reorganized so many times in the intervening 60 years that identifying a successor was legally incoherent, and that the authentication standard the officer was applying had been written for active family archives, not dissolved secondary research branches. She was correct. He could see that immediately. He had waited until the argument concluded, which it did with the authentication officer agreeing to escalate the flag to the house's legal review team, which meant a delay of 10 days minimum, which meant Eubelina was going to leave the auction house without completing the transaction she had come to complete. He had introduced himself in the lobby. "You know who I am," she had said, which seemed to be a sentence a lot of people said to him. "I know you were associated with Riser Phoenix. I know you're not anymore." A slight tension in her expression. "That's one way to describe it. I have a simpler solution to your authentication problem," he had said. "If you're interested." The solution was this: the 11 items in question fell within a category of artifacts that Issei had, 3 months earlier, obtained a general acquisition license for through a mechanism he had developed involving a dormant trade charter from the 18th century that technically granted acquisition rights to any dissolved archive material from secondary research branches of families that had undergone 2 or more organizational restructurings. The charter had been written to facilitate academic preservation and had never been used for commercial purposes because no one had thought to use it for commercial purposes. He had thought to use it for commercial purposes. Eubelina had looked at him for a long moment. "You want the consignment." "I want the consignment, and I want the person who assembled it," he had said. "I need someone who understands what's in these archives and can identify what's worth acquiring before it surfaces at an auction house and becomes expensive and complicated." Another long look. "What are the terms?" The terms had taken 2 meetings to finalize. She was not cheap and she was not easy to convince, and she had 3 non-negotiable conditions, 2 of which he accepted immediately, and 1 of which he had to modify before she would agree. But she had agreed. And she was, as he had assessed from the lobby argument, extraordinarily good at what she did. She was waiting in his office when he returned from the Goblin meeting, with a tablet displaying a 3-dimensional schematic of something that looked like a crossbow designed by someone who had very specific views about what crossbows ought to be capable of. "The Phoenix Secondary Archive has a manifest gap," she said, without preamble. 43 items that were listed in the intake records when the archive was first catalogued but are not listed in the dissolution records from 60 years ago. Somewhere between cataloging and dissolution, 43 items were removed from the archive without documentation. Removed by whom? Unknown. But the items' category classifications are still in the intake records, and 3 of them are flagged with a designation I've only seen in 2 other archives. Old Phoenix Internal Code, Hazard Persistent, Ethics Review Pending. Meaning? Meaning they were considered dangerous not because of their offensive capacity but because of their potential to permanently alter something. The classification is usually applied to items that affect the fundamental rules of a specific magical system. Not weapons in the conventional sense. More like, she paused, searching for the accurate term, leverage points. He looked at the schematic on her tablet. "And the crossbow? That's something else entirely. That's from Lot 7 in the Northern Warehouse Cluster, which we're clearing this week. It was built for a mercenary company that folded before it was delivered. The enchantment matrix is," she tilted her head slightly, "quite creative. Whoever designed it had opinions about terminal velocity that I find professionally interesting. Can we replicate it? The matrix?" With the right artificer, yes. Probably with some improvements. The original design has an elegant core, but the outer layers are inefficient. Put it on the development list. And find me the file on those 43 missing items. If someone pulled them from the Phoenix archive without documentation 60 years ago, they went somewhere, and I'd like to know where. She made a note. Then she set the tablet down and looked at him with the particular quality of attention she used when she had something to say that she was calibrating. The Chaos Brigade's interest in Warehouse 7, she said. I've identified the intermediary organization. It's a procurement group operating out of the border territories. They've been active for about 2 years and they specialize in, a brief pause, things that other procurement groups won't touch. Threat level? On their own? Manageable. As a symptom of who they're working for? Worth watching very carefully. He nodded. Add them to Rayner's monitoring list. He looked out the window at the amber sky. The 3 parties interested in Warehouse 7. The missing Phoenix items. Item 77. He said it quietly, almost to himself. Something is converging. That's usually when things get expensive, Eubelina said. Or lucrative, he said. Depending on which side of the transaction you're on. Chapter 4. The Kirin Problem. Monster Tribes and the Question of Loyalty. Loyalty was a product like anything else. That was a thought Issei had tested against his own moral sense for several weeks before accepting it, not because it felt wrong but because it felt too convenient, and he had learned to be suspicious of conclusions that aligned too neatly with his immediate interests. He had sat with it. He had looked for the places where it broke down. He had found, eventually, that it did not so much break down as complicate. Loyalty was a product, but not all forms of it were equivalent, and the market for genuine long-term commitment was structured very differently from the market for short-term compliance. The distinction mattered because he needed loyalty that would hold under pressure. Compliance that held only while conditions were favorable was not protection. It was a costume. The Kirin tribes of the deep forest territories had a reputation for precisely the kind of loyalty he needed. They also had a reputation for being extraordinarily difficult to negotiate with, a characteristic that he found reassuring rather than concerning for reasons he had articulated to Rayner in a memo that she had read with her most skeptical expression, and then filed without comment. The Kirin were not horses with horns, which was a common human misconception imported through cultural transmission that had nothing to do with the actual creatures. They were large, they were quadrupedal for roughly half their operational existence, and they had a single prominent structure on their foreheads that could be described as a horn only in the way that a lightning rod could be described as a stick. More accurately, it was a focusing apparatus for a form of energy manipulation that the Underworld's mainstream magical research community had classified as outside the standard theoretical framework and declined to study, which meant that it had remained unstudied for 3 centuries while the Kirin tribes had gone on developing it independently with zero interference, which had produced results. They were deeply private and ferociously territorial, and they maintained their forest holds against encroachment with an efficiency that several mid-tier noble families had learned about at significant cost. They did not trade. They did not negotiate. They did not accept visitors. Issei had gotten an introduction through a route so indirect that explaining it took longer than the introduction itself. The short version was that Vrak knew a goblin freight operator who ran a circuit through the outer edge of the forest territories, who had over 30 years of route running developed a carefully maintained non-threatening relationship with the Kirin border patrols, who had mentioned to the operator that the tribe's southern hold was experiencing a crop failure due to a soil contamination problem they did not have the resources to address. And the operator had mentioned this to Vrak because he felt bad about it, and did not know what to do with the information, and Vrak had mentioned it to Issei because she had been paying attention to what kinds of problems he found interesting. He had found it interesting. He had spent 3 weeks identifying the source of the soil contamination, which turned out to be a leaking magical waste reservoir from a noble family's abandoned processing facility 17 miles north of the hold, which was technically the noble family's responsibility to remediate, except that the family in question was currently engaged in a succession dispute that had paralyzed their administrative capacity for the past 8 months. He had commissioned the remediation himself, through a contractor he used for environmental projects, with a timeline of 40 days and a budget that was significant but not ruinous. Then he had sent a letter to the hold. The letter did not ask for anything. It explained who had commissioned the remediation and why, and indicated that the work would proceed regardless of whether the hold chose to respond or not, and that no obligation of any kind was being implied or requested. It was 3 paragraphs long and had been revised 11 times. The hold had responded 2 weeks later with a letter of 4 sentences that confirmed receipt, acknowledged the remediation work, and asked, with an economy of expression that communicated both genuine curiosity and careful caution, what he wanted. He had written back, a meeting, if they were willing. Nothing else yet. The meeting had been arranged for the edge of the forest, which was traditional Kirin territory for conversations with outsiders, far enough inside their border to be their ground, close enough to the treeline to be visible from outside, so that the outsider could see the density of the forest ahead and understand the advantage they were choosing to extend. The Kirin who met him was named Thessaly. She was in her bipedal form, which was tall and precise in its movements, and she wore the kind of practical clothing that suggested function had been the entire design consideration. Her horn, which was actually a focusing structure, emitted a low continuous frequency that Drake noted quietly from inside the gauntlet without elaborating. You remediated the south field, she said. The contractor did. I arranged and funded it. Why? He had thought about how to answer this for some time. He gave her the honest answer, because she was someone who would detect the distance between an honest answer and a strategic one, and he did not want to begin with that distance in the room, because the contamination was a solvable problem, and you didn't have access to the solution. Because addressing it costs me something manageable and costs you something much larger if it continues. And because I'm building something that requires trust from entities I haven't worked with before, and I'd rather build that trust by solving a real problem first than by making an abstract offer. She was quiet. The frequency from her focusing structure shifted by a tone he couldn't name. What are you building? A trade network? A security apparatus? A set of relationships that makes the lower and middle territories of the underworld more stable and more prosperous for the entities that actually live there as opposed to the ones that administer it from a distance. And for yourself. Yes. The two aren't incompatible. Most people who say that mean the first part as decoration for the second. Some do, he agreed. I mean both. She studied him for what felt like a long time. Then she said, we don't trade. We don't enter agreements with outside parties. We have held this position for 300 years. I know. You're asking us to change it. I'm asking you to consider whether 300 years of isolation has produced outcomes you're satisfied with, he said. The contamination happened because a noble family's facility operated 17 miles from your southern hold for 40 years and you had no mechanism to hold them accountable for it, or even to know about it before it became critical. That's the cost of isolation. I'm not saying it isn't worth paying. I'm saying it's worth examining. Another long silence. The forest around them was very quiet. Come back in a month, she said. We'll continue this. He had come back in a month. And the month after that. And the month after that. It was now the 4th meeting, and the conversation had grown in specificity, and in something he was carefully not calling warmth because that was not quite the right word. Mutual respect was closer. A shared appreciation for precision. Thessaly spoke in complete sentences that contained exactly as much information as was necessary and never more, and he found that he was learning to do the same. The Northern Territory families have been expanding their logging operations, she said at the 4th meeting. 3 miles deeper into the secondary forest than the administrative boundary permits. The relevant official has been, she paused, selecting the word, accommodated. Which official? She told him. He wrote down the name. The accommodation can be ended, he said. It will create a different kind of problem for the families involved, but that's their problem to manage. In exchange, I'd want documentation of the boundary violations for use in, he considered, a commercial dispute I'm currently developing. Commercial dispute, she said, in the tone of someone verifying terminology. The logging families are also blocking a freight corridor that the Goblin Syndicate needs clear. The boundary violation documentation gives me leverage in that dispute that I currently don't have. She was quiet for a moment. Then, if we provide documentation, what do we receive? Access to the waste remediation contractor at cost, for any environmental issue in your territories within range of current operations. And, he said, a formal advisory seat in the commercial network I'm building? No obligation to trade. No obligation to participate in any specific transaction. The ability to see what's moving through the territories adjacent to yours and to flag anything that affects your interests before it becomes a contamination event. The frequency from her focusing structure changed again. This time it had a quality he was beginning to associate with recalculation. An advisory seat is not membership. No. It's visibility. Membership is its own conversation for another time. I don't think you're ready for it, and I don't think I've earned it. She looked at him steadily. You're patient for someone your age. I'm patient because I'm building something that takes time, he said. Short-term extraction would be easier. I'm not interested in easy. She delivered the boundary violation documentation to his office 2 days later, through the freight operator who had first mentioned the soil contamination. He used it to end the logging family's commercial blockage of the freight corridor in a meeting that took 40 minutes and generated a legal settlement that was significantly more favorable to the Goblin Syndicate than to the logging families. He sent Thessaly a copy of the settlement, with a note, Step 1. She sent back, Step 1 noted. He filed this under progress and moved to the next problem. Chapter 5, The Convergence. What Item 77 contains. The research into the pre-Phoenix history of Warehouse 7 took Rayner's contractor 12 days, which was faster than Issei had expected and expensive enough to confirm that the contractor was very good at what they did. The report that arrived on his desk was 40 pages and included a genealogy of administrative ownership that went back 800 years, a cross-referenced analysis of the original construction records, and a section near the end that was flagged with a small notation in the contractor's handwriting. This is the part you actually wanted. He read the flagged section first. The warehouse had been built not by the Phoenix clan but by an organization that predated the current noble family structure of the Underworld by roughly 4 centuries. The organization was listed in the construction permits under a name that translated, from a dialect of Old Underworld that the contractor had apparently needed to bring in a linguistics specialist for, as something approximating the custodians of the unmade record. There was no other reference to this organization in any standard archive. The contractor had found exactly 3 additional mentions of it in highly obscure secondary sources and had included all 3 in the appendix with notes. The first mention was in a personal letter from a senior devil administrator to a colleague, dated approximately 500 years ago, referring to the custodians as an organization that had voluntarily dissolved itself after completing its stated purpose, and expressing relief that their particular area of work was now closed. The second was in a list of prohibited research topics issued by an academic body that no longer existed, which included, in the last entry, the custodian's method and its applications. The third was in a fragment of a document that had apparently been water-damaged and was only partially legible, but which included the phrase, translated from the same Old Underworld dialect, "The object that remembers what was decided before deciding was possible." He sat with this for a long time. "Drake," he said. "Yes," the dragon said, with the particular quality of attention he used when he already knew what was going to be asked. "The chest. The thing you said chose to compress itself into a state of extreme patience. Does it remember things?" A long pause. Not the pause of someone searching for information but the pause of someone deciding how much of the information they already had to share. "Yes," Drake said. "I believe it remembers a decision. A very specific decision that was made before the current architecture of the Underworld was finalized. A decision about how power was going to be distributed, and what the rules of that distribution were going to be. And if someone accessed those memories, they would know the original terms," Drake said. "The actual founding agreements, before the documents were written and the documents were lost and the interpretations accumulated and the original meaning was buried under 4 centuries of institutional revision. They would know what was actually decided. Not what was claimed to have been decided." Issei was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That's why the Chaos Brigade wants it. And why Leviathan's office was asking questions about it. Not because it's a weapon. Because it's evidence. Evidence of what was," Drake confirmed. "Which in the right context can be more destabilizing than any weapon." He stood up and went to the window. The amber sky was shifting toward the deeper red of early evening, the underworld's approximation of a sunset, and the lights of the lower districts were beginning to appear in the geography below his building like embers in cooling ash. He thought about what he was holding. He thought about what it meant that three separate interested parties had independently identified its location and decided to pursue it quietly rather than loudly, which meant all three of them understood what it was and all three of them were concerned about what the other two might do if they moved too openly. He thought about his network. The Goblin Syndicate and its freight corridors. The Weapons Archive and its leverage points. Thessaly and her advisory seat and the patience of a tribe that had held its territory for 3 centuries without anyone's help. Eubelina and her knowledge of things that had been catalogued and mislaid and forgotten. He thought about Rainier, who was somewhere in this building right now reading reports and making connections and filing notes under the name he had given the Information Archive when he first set it up, which was the same name he had given it the night he read the first draft of what it might eventually become, which was a word he had written in his notebook at 3 in the morning after a long time thinking. Network. He was 19 years old. He had been a passenger once. He had a chest in a warehouse in Sector 4 that contained memories of what the world had agreed to before it forgot what it had agreed to, and 3 factions of considerable power were interested in it, and his network was not yet large enough to guarantee their neutralization if they decided to act. He needed to make it larger. He needed to move faster. He needed to secure Item 77 in a location that was known to him, and not to anyone else before the 3 interested parties finished their quiet assessments, and arrived at the conclusion that action was preferable to observation. He estimated 8 weeks. Perhaps 10. He pulled his coat from the hook by the door and went out into the underworld evening, moving with the particular quality of purpose of someone who has looked at the shape of the problem and decided that it is, at least, an interesting one. Behind him, in the building's secure archive room, the network's central index turned over a new entry, time-stamped and prioritized, at the top of the morning's action list. The entry read, Item 77. Move before convergence. Everything depends on speed. Below it, in the field labeled Priority, someone had drawn a small star. Act 2, The Cost of Moving Fast. Chapters 6 through 12. Chapter 6, Relocation. 8 weeks is not as long as it sounds. He had moved Item 77 on the 3rd day after writing the priority notice, which meant he had started before he had fully decided where to put it, which was not ideal but was preferable to waiting until the destination was finalized while 3 factions continued their quiet assessments. Speed was the variable he could control. Destination was a variable he could optimize in parallel. The chest left Warehouse 7 at 2 in the morning on a freight cart operated by one of the Goblin Syndicate's most trusted circuit runners, a goblin named Tech who had been running the eastern corridors for 40 years and whose discretion Vrak had personally vouched for in terms that left no room for qualification. The manifest listed the cargo as Lot 44, miscellaneous archival materials, non-perishable, low-priority transit. Tech drove the cart through 4 sector checkpoints without incident, which was itself evidence of how completely the Syndicate's logistics network had been threaded through the administrative infrastructure of the lower underworld. Checkpoint officers who had been accommodated did not ask questions about low-priority transit. The chest arrived at a location that was not listed under Issei's name in any public registry and not easily traceable to him through the usual ownership chains. It was a sub-basement storage unit beneath a building that nominally belonged to a small trading company whose principals were 3 goblin merchants who had sold the company's majority stake to a holding entity 6 months ago, and had not looked closely at the holding entity's ownership structure. The holding entity's ownership structure, if examined closely, was a series of 7 administrative layers that terminated at a shelf company registered in a commercial zone that had no reciprocal information sharing agreement with the main Underworld Territory Registry. Issei had designed this structure himself, over the course of 2 weeks, using the same methodical approach he applied to everything. He had tested it by attempting to trace it from the outside, which had taken him 3 hours even knowing what he was looking for. He had then hired a third party to attempt the same trace without providing any starting information. The third party had gotten to Layer 4 in 2 days and stopped there, reporting that the chain terminated in a dead end. The chain did not terminate in a dead end. It terminated in him. But only if you knew what you were looking for at Layer 5, and the only people who knew what to look for at Layer 5 were him and Rainer, who had helped design that specific layer and whose professional investment in its integrity was therefore personal. He had been in the sub-basement twice since the chest arrived, both times alone, both times in the early hours of the morning. He sat in front of it, and listened to it, and tried to understand what Drake had told him without pressing too hard on the thing itself, because he had learned early in his commercial education that the worst thing you could do with an asset of uncertain nature was handle it impulsively. You catalogued. You observed. You let the asset tell you what it was before you decided what to do with it. On the second visit, Drake had said, with the quality of careful precision he used when the information was important, and also partially incomplete, it knows you've moved it. It's not distressed. If anything, I would describe its current state as curious. Can it communicate? Not in any language I recognize. But it registers awareness. It registers intention. It knows that the person who moved it is the same person who is sitting in front of it right now, and it knows that that person is thinking carefully about it rather than acting on it, and I believe, Drake said, with a quality in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite concern, that it approves of that approach. Issei had sat with this for a while. How would a chest approve of anything? In the same way that any entity which compresses itself into an object for an extremely long time would communicate its state of mind, Drake said. Slowly. Indirectly. Through the way it responds to the attention being paid to it. Which is not, he added, so different from people. He had filed this under things that required extended consideration and returned to the surface. The morning after the relocation, he held the first full staff briefing he had called in 3 months. Staff was a loose term. What he had was not an organization with a chart and clearly defined departments. What he had was a set of individuals with specific capabilities who had agreed to work within a common framework for reasons that varied by individual and that he had made no attempt to homogenize. He had learned early that homogenizing motivation produced unreliable results. People who were all working toward the same stated goal for different actual reasons were difficult to coordinate and easy to fragment. He preferred to know exactly why each person was in the room and to structure his requests accordingly. Rainer was there because she was the intelligence operation, and the intelligence operation was everything. Without accurate information, the rest of the enterprise was a blindfolded man swinging expensive equipment in a dark room. Ubeluna was there because she was the artifact knowledge base, and the artifact operation was currently generating 60% of his revenue and 100% of his strategic leverage. Tech was there because Tech had been personally invited by Vrak as the syndicate's operational liaison, a development that communicated the growing seriousness of the partnership in a way that a formal statement would not have. And Milhita was there because Milhita was new, and her presence at the briefing was a deliberate signal to the other three that she was now part of the core operation. Milhita was a harpy. Not the screeching, disorganized creatures of human mythology, but a member of a species that had been occupying the air corridors of the mid-underworld for as long as the underworld had existed, and that had developed, in the course of that occupation, a comprehensive operational understanding of aerial transit, atmospheric surveillance, and the kind of three-dimensional spatial reasoning that ground-based species consistently undervalued. She was approximately 27 years old by harpy reckoning, which meant she was mature but not set in her habits, and she had come to him through a recommendation from Thessaly, who had noted in her characteristically economical way that the harpy operations in the forest border regions had been providing informal early warning of incursions for years with no formal compensation arrangement, and that this struck her as an inefficiency worth addressing. He had agreed. He had met Milhita, who was direct and technically precise and had a quality of three-dimensional thinking that revealed itself in the way she described spatial relationships, always in terms of altitude and approach angle as well as horizontal distance. He had offered her a contract. She had negotiated it with the same professional confidence as everyone else on his team, which he considered a consistent and encouraging pattern. She sat now with her wings folded close, her head tilted at the slight angle she used when she was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously, and watched the briefing with large amber eyes that missed nothing. He laid out the situation without preamble. 3 parties are aware of or actively seeking Item 77. The item has been relocated. The relocation was clean and the trail is covered to a standard I'm satisfied with for the next 8 to 12 weeks. After that, the coverage will need to be refreshed. In that window, I need 3 things. I need to know who specifically is behind each of the 3 inquiries and what their operational capacity is. I need the network expanded enough that a hostile move against any of our assets by any one of the 3 parties would be commercially costly to them in ways that are immediately apparent. And I need to understand what Item 77 actually is well enough to make a decision about what to do with it. Silence for a moment. The Chaos Brigade inquiry, Rainier said. I've identified the procurement group. It's run by a former mid-tier devil who left the noble structure about 15 years ago, and has been operating in the border territories since. His name is Voriel. He's competent, resourceful, and works for hire rather than ideology, which means the brigade contracted him rather than assigning one of their true believers to the acquisition, which tells us they want this done quietly and without the symbolic weight of a named brigade operative, which suggests they're concerned about how it would look if they were seen actively pursuing it. Yes. The thing they're trying to acquire is essentially proof of original terms. If the Chaos Brigade is seen seeking it, the obvious interpretation is that they want to use those terms as a destabilization tool. They'd rather acquire it first, and then decide how to use it than acquire it visibly and have their intentions assumed before they're ready. What's Voriel's operational capacity? Small team. 6 to 8 individuals, mixed species, all competent. He doesn't use brute force as a primary tool. His track record suggests he prefers to manufacture situations where the target delivers itself. Issei considered this. Then we don't give him a situation to manufacture. What about the Leviathan connection? That's more complex, Rainier said, and there was a quality in her voice that he had learned to pay attention to, the particular flatness she used when the information was significant and also potentially personal. The inquiry from Leviathan's office was made by a single individual using a cover identity. I've identified the individual. It's not an official Leviathan operation. It's a private initiative by someone within the office who became aware of Item 77 through their official access and chose to pursue it independently. Name: Corvinus. 3rd Administrative Secretary to the Undersecretary of Regional Commerce. Mid-level position. Significant file access. And she paused, a personal history of collecting unusual artifacts outside official channels. He filed this. The third party. The independent collector, less threatening than the other 2 on the surface. But I've found a connection between the collector and Voriel that suggests they're not entirely independent. Money moved between entities linked to both of them approximately 4 months ago. I don't know the nature of the arrangement. But I don't think the 3 inquiries are as separate as they appeared initially. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone processed this. So potentially a coordinated search with 3 apparent faces, Eubelina said. Potentially. Or 2 parties who independently found a common facilitator. Issei looked at the window for a moment. Then at Milhida. What's your assessment of aerial surveillance coverage over the lower districts? Specifically Sector 4 and the adjacent corridors. Milhida had been waiting for this. She described the current aerial monitoring landscape in the precise spatial language he had come to expect from her, covering the active surveillance positions of 4 different parties, the gaps between them, the drift patterns that created predictable blind spots at specific times, and the 3 routes she had already identified through which material could be moved without crossing any active monitoring field. He listened to all of it. Then, can you establish a rotating observation post on the eastern approach to Sector 4 without it being detectable from the existing surveillance positions? Yes. Give me 2 days to set the rotations and confirm the angles. Do it. I want to know about anyone who enters that sector and does not have an obvious commercial reason to be there. She nodded and made a note with the small stylus she kept at the base of one wing. He looked at the group. Tech. In the next 3 weeks I'm going to need the Sector 6 corridor capacity expanded. Not for Item 77. For the Eastern Basin contract I'm closing. But if the expansion is already in motion when we need to use that corridor for other purposes, it won't create a pattern that's identifiable. Tetch's expression, which was professionally neutral at most times, shifted slightly. Vrak anticipated you'd want that. She's already allocated the resources. I'm here to get the timeline. He looked at the old goblin with something close to genuine warmth. Tell her, 3 weeks, and I owe her a favor she can name within reason. Tetch made a note. She'll hold you to that. I'm counting on it. The briefing ended 40 minutes later with a distributed action list and a follow-up schedule. As the room cleared, Rainier stayed. She waited until they were alone in the way she always waited, with the patience of someone who had learned to choose exactly the right moment for the conversation she had already decided to have. Corvinus, she said. The secretary. He's not just a collector. I have more background now. He's been building a private archive of foundational documents for 11 years. Not for sale. Not for leverage. He's building it because he's a genuine historian, and he believes that the current power structure of the Underworld rests on a systematic misrepresentation of what was originally agreed to when it was founded. Issei looked at her carefully. He thinks the same thing Item 77 contains would prove. He thinks that yes. He has no idea Item 77 exists. He was following a trail through the historical records that happened to point toward that warehouse cluster. Could he be an ally? The question sat between them for a moment. He's inside Leviathan's office, she said. If he's compromised, or if his private investigation is ever surfaced by someone looking for leverage, he becomes a liability in the most dangerous proximity to power. That's the risk. I asked if he could be an ally. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said finally. But only if you approach it correctly. He would need to believe you're motivated by the same thing he's motivated by. And am I? A pause. You're motivated by understanding what Item 77 is so you can make a rational decision about its value. He's motivated by historical truth as a kind of justice. Those aren't the same thing. They're not incompatible things. No, she agreed. But he'll need to believe in the overlap before he'll trust you. He filed this under approaches requiring further development, and moved to the next problem. There was always a next problem. That was, he had decided, the clearest sign that the enterprise was alive. Chapter 7, The Eastern Basin Contract. How you buy the loyalty of a mountain. The Eastern Basin was not a basin in any geological sense. It was a territory designation from the old administrative maps that had been used long enough to become the common name, and what it described was a broad commercial zone in the mid-underworld where approximately 9 distinct monster tribes had been coexisting for several centuries in a state of managed tension that worked well enough to sustain commerce and badly enough to sustain a significant conflict mediation industry. The Troll Confederacy occupied the largest portion of the Eastern Basin. They were not the simple creatures of human legend. They were large, yes, between 8 and 12 feet in standard adult configuration, and their physical strength was considerable, but the Confederacy had developed over 3 centuries into something more accurately described as a guild-based industrial civilization, with a metallurgical tradition that was the most sophisticated in the lower underworld and a negotiating culture that placed extraordinary value on the precise meaning of words. A troll contract was said to be the most binding document in existence, not because of any magical enforcement mechanism but because the troll culture's treatment of dishonesty was so deeply negative that no Confederacy member who valued their standing would ever attempt to renegotiate an agreed term after the fact. He had been working toward this contract for 4 months. The approach had required patience of a kind he found genuinely difficult, which meant it was good practice. The Confederacy did not respond well to direct proposals from unknown parties. They responded to demonstrated reliability over time, which meant he had spent the first 2 months simply placing small, clean orders for metallurgical components through legitimate channels, paying exactly on time, never renegotiating the agreed price, and communicating in the precise and bounded language that their culture associated with seriousness. He had studied their communication style thoroughly enough to know that certain phrases were formal markers of respect and certain others were casual language that they associated with parties who were not fully committed to the interaction. He used the formal markers consistently. Not performatively. Actually, because he found that once he understood the logic behind them, the formal language was simply more accurate. It said exactly what it meant. That was a feature, not a formality. By the third month, the Confederacy's commercial liaison had begun responding to his orders with brief notes that acknowledged the standing of his account. By the fourth month, the liaison had suggested, in the careful language that passed for an invitation in their culture, that a representative meeting might be arranged to discuss expanded arrangements. He had prepared for the meeting for 2 weeks. The table. The meeting location was a conference space maintained by the Eastern Basin Commercial Exchange, a neutral venue that both parties had used before and that came with the implicit endorsement of the exchange's long institutional history. The room was large by necessity, designed for species of varying physical scale, with ceiling clearance that accommodated the Confederacy's standard negotiating delegation without requiring them to accommodate themselves to human-scale architecture. He arrived precisely on time, which was itself a communication. The Troll understanding of punctuality held that arriving significantly early communicated anxiety and arriving late communicated disrespect, and that the correct arrival time was within a window of 3 minutes before or after the agreed hour. He arrived 2 minutes before. The Confederacy's delegation was 3 trolls. The chief negotiator was a figure he recognized from commercial records as Grunder, who held the title of First Voice of the Southern Assembly, which in Confederacy structure meant he had been selected to represent the will of the Assembly in external negotiations and was empowered to bind the Confederacy contractually within limits the Assembly had pre-approved. He was 11 feet tall and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who was always aware of the space their body occupied. His face had the quality of a landscape that had been shaped by weather over a very long time, complex and expressive in ways that took attention to read. The second troll was a technical specialist whose name Issei did not recognize from prior research, which meant she was brought specifically for this meeting, which meant there was a specific technical matter the Confederacy anticipated discussing. He filed this without reacting to it. The third troll was young, perhaps 50 years old, and was there to observe and learn. He was careful with his body in the way of someone who was not yet certain of their own scale, which Issei found unexpectedly familiar. They exchanged the formal greeting sequence, which had 7 steps and took approximately 4 minutes, and which he had practiced enough times that he could execute it without the slight hesitation that had been present at the first commercial exchange meeting 3 months ago. Issei Hyoudou, Grunder said, when the greeting was complete. We note your account's consistent record. I note the Confederacy's consistent standards, he said. They made the account easy to maintain, a slight shift in Grunder's expression that was, in troll terms, the equivalent of a warm smile. You have brought a proposal regarding expanded arrangements, Grunder said. We have reviewed your preliminary communication. We have questions. I welcome them. The questions were thorough. They covered the supply chain architecture he was proposing, the ownership structure of his distribution network, the legal standing of his acquisition licenses, the nature of his relationship with the Gremery family, and the extent to which that relationship created obligations that might conflict with Confederacy interests, the financial reserves behind the proposed contract value, and the remediation provisions in the event of a supply failure. He answered each question completely and without qualification, because the Confederacy's culture treated partial answers as worse than no answer. The technical specialist spoke for the first time during a section of questions about the enchantment integration specifications for a specific category of metallurgical output. She had a rapid, precise way of describing technical parameters that confirmed she was a specialist of significant depth, and she found 2 places in his proposal where the specifications he had used were technically correct but did not reflect the most current Confederacy production standards, which had been updated 8 months ago. He had not known about the update. He acknowledged it directly and asked her to specify the correct parameters. She did. He made the adjustments to his proposal document, visible to both parties, without attempting to minimize the fact that his original specifications had been outdated. Grunder watched this with an expression he could not fully read. After the technical corrections were complete, the chief negotiator said, "You amended without resistance. The correct specifications are more useful to me than the incorrect ones," he said. Resistance would have been inefficient. Many parties treat the acknowledgement of error as a negotiating weakness. Many parties are wrong about that. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. By the end of it, the Confederacy had agreed in principle to a supply partnership that covered 3 categories of metallurgical output, committed to a minimum volume that represented roughly a quarter of their current annual external sales, and included a preferential access clause that gave his network first offer on any specialty production items before they were offered to the open market. In exchange, he was providing a stable long-term price floor that insulated the Confederacy from market volatility, a freight infrastructure through the Goblin Syndicate that reduced their distribution costs by 18%, and a legal consultation resource for contract disputes with outside parties, which was something the Confederacy had been quietly in need of for years because their own negotiating culture was excellent, but the broader Underworld's contract law had accumulated interpretive layers that made it difficult to navigate without specialist knowledge. The legal consultation resource was, in practice, a referral to a barrister Issei Hyoudou on retainer who specialized in cross-species commercial law and who had agreed to a discounted rate for Confederacy clients in exchange for a small piece of the ongoing commercial relationship. It had cost him almost nothing to arrange and was, he suspected, the element of the proposal the Confederacy found most valuable. The young troll who had been observing said something to Grunder in the Confederacy's internal dialect as they were preparing to close. Grunder replied briefly and then turned back to Issei. Our observer notes that you speak to us as though the arrangement benefits both parties equally. It does benefit both parties, he said. The margins are real on both sides. A deal that benefits only one party tends to generate resentment, and resentment is expensive. Grunder was quiet for a moment. Then you are young. Yes. We have dealt with young operators before. They have a tendency toward impatience when the scale of what they are building presses against the pace at which it can be built. I know the feeling, he said honestly. I've been working on managing it. Something in the chief negotiator's expression shifted again, this time into a register he had not seen before. He filed it carefully. We will have the formal contract draft to you within 10 days, Grunder said. I'll have our review ready within 5 days of receipt. Good. They exchanged the closing sequence, which had 5 steps and took 3 minutes, and then the Confederacy delegation left, and Issei sat in the large conference room for a moment by himself, in the kind of stillness that followed a significant thing. The Troll Confederacy was the largest single industrial producer in the Eastern Basin. Their endorsement of his network, which would become visible to other basin entities through the supply chain changes he was introducing, was worth more than the contract value itself. It was a signal. And signals, in commercial ecosystems, propagated. He thought about Grunder's observation about impatience. He thought about the 8-week window and Item 77 in its sub-basement, and Voriel assembling a team in the border territories and Corvinus building a private archive out of conviction and Seraphal Leviathan's secretary sending quiet inquiries through 4 intermediaries. He thought faster. He picked up his coat and went to find a way to move faster. Chapter 8 Voriel, the man who manufactures situations. Rainer's profile of Voriel had been 12 pages. He had read it twice and then asked her to walk him through it verbally, because the verbal walkthrough often surfaced details that did not fully register on the page. This was partly about how he processed information and partly about the way Rainer's intelligence briefings worked. She included in the written document what she could document, but she reserved judgment and interpretation for the spoken version, which meant the spoken version contained the more important material. Voriel was 53 years old. He had left the noble structure in his late 30s after a commercial dispute with his patron clan that he had lost despite being, by most external assessments, correct on the merits. The dispute had cost him his standing and his registered assets and a personal relationship he had apparently valued, and the combination of these losses in close succession had produced in him the particular quality of focused detachment that Rainer described as the professional equivalent of scar tissue. A surface that looked smooth but was in fact the product of something having healed over damage. He was not ideological. He did not work for the Chaos Brigade because he believed in what they believed in. He worked for them because they paid well and because their projects tended toward the interesting and because his reputation in the border territory procurement market was built on successful completion of difficult jobs, which meant that working for the brigade was the kind of assignment that would sustain his reputation regardless of whether it concluded in their favor. He had a team of 6. Rainier had identified 5 of them with varying confidence levels. 2 were former military, 1 was a specialist in magical lock and seal systems, 1 was a logistics expert, and 1 was a species she described as a shade, which was a category of entity that Issei had not encountered before and had needed to research. Shades were information space entities. They did not exist in the physical world in a conventional sense, which meant that conventional surveillance was blind to them. They moved through the informational layers of a space, reading what had been recorded and transmitted and stored, which made them extraordinarily effective intelligence assets and also extraordinarily disturbing to think about too concretely. He had spent an entire evening thinking about what it meant to have a shade potentially operating in the informational environment around his network. He made a decision in the early hours of the morning 3 days after the Eastern Basin contract meeting. He was going to approach Voriel directly. Rainier had looked at him when he told her this with the specific expression she used when she thought he was making a mistake but was reserving full judgment until she understood his reasoning. "Walk me through it," she said. "Voriel is operating quietly because his client wants the acquisition done without visible brigade involvement. If I approach him, I'm making the approach visible. That visibility creates a problem for his client, because his client doesn't want any of this surfaced. It also makes you visible to his client. They already know I have the item. They're pursuing it. Making myself visible to them on my terms is better than becoming visible on their terms." She was quiet for a moment. "And Voriel specifically? Not just a message to his client through him? Voriel is competent, and not ideological. If I can offer him something more interesting than the completion of this contract, there's a real chance he takes it. If he doesn't, I've still sent a message to his client that I know the shape of the operation, which changes their calculation about whether to continue it." "What are you offering him?" "A problem worth solving." She looked at him steadily. "That's not specific. It can't be specific until I know what he finds interesting. Which I won't know until I'm in the room with him. And if he decides that eliminating you is a cleaner solution than whatever you're offering?" He had thought about this carefully. His reputation is built on successful discrete acquisitions, not on violence. A violent solution to me creates noise that his current client has specifically paid to avoid. That constraint is real and he knows it, which means he knows that I know it. There's a framework in that room before I've said a word. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she began preparing the contact protocol. The border territory meeting. The contact was made through a channel Rainier constructed specifically for the purpose, a single-use intermediary who would deliver a message and confirm receipt and then have no further involvement. The message contained 4 sentences. It identified Issei by name, described item 77 by its administrative designation without any indication of its actual nature, indicated that he was aware of the current acquisition effort and wished to discuss an alternative arrangement, and provided a location and a time. Voriel responded within 6 hours. He said, "I'll be there." The location Issei had selected was a commercial way station on the eastern edge of the border territories, which was technically neutral ground and also far enough from both parties' operational areas that neither had an obvious home advantage. The way station served the freight traffic moving between the middle and lower underworld and had the quality of most high-traffic commercial nodes. Anonymous and busy enough that 2 people having a private conversation were essentially invisible. Voriel was already there when he arrived, which communicated something. Either he had wanted the home advantage of being in position first, or he had come early to assess the environment, or he was simply someone who was always early to meetings in the border territories because being early was how you stayed alive in an environment where being late meant you had given someone time to prepare for your arrival. Issei suspected it was the third reason with some of the second mixed in. He was shorter than Issei had expected. Intelligence profiles had described him as average height for a devil male, but there was a quality to the way he occupied space that suggested he had long ago decided to make no assumptions about what size communicated about capability. He had the look of someone who had been comfortable in uncomfortable environments for so long that discomfort had become his baseline operating state. "You came alone," Voriel said. Not surprised. Noting it. "You did as well. I generally find that conversations proceed better without audiences. We agree on something already." They sat at a corner table with walls on two sides and clear sightlines in the other two directions, which they had both moved toward without discussion, which communicated something about the similarity of their situational assessment methodology. You know about my contract, Voriel said. I know its shape. Not all the details. The item you've designated as item 77. Yes. And you've moved it. Yes. A slight shift in his expression. My shade has been running information sweeps of the relevant sector for 4 days and hasn't located it. I know. The shift became something more complex. Not frustration. More like the recalibration of an assessment. You knew about the shade. I identified your team composition through a different route. I'm not going to tell you which one. He made a sound that was almost appreciative. What do you want? I want to offer you something more interesting than the completion of your current contract. My current client would take a very negative view of my accepting a counter-offer. Your current client takes a negative view of a great many things, Issei said. The brigade is not an easy employer. They have strong opinions about what their operators owe them and relatively flexible opinions about what they owe their operators. A pause. Longer than the previous ones. You've done research on my history. Enough to know that ideological employers have been costly for you before. The silence this produced had weight. What are you offering? Voriel said, and the quality of the question had changed. It was still cautious. But it was no longer rhetorical. A retainer with my network. Procurement and acquisition, which is what you do. Difficult targets, which is what you prefer. Commercial clients rather than ideological ones, which means your success conditions are clear rather than subject to retrospective reinterpretation. And protection, in the sense that my network's infrastructure means that anyone interested in applying pressure to my operators has to first account for what disrupting those operators would cost them commercially. Voriel looked at the table for a moment. Then at the middle distance. Then back. The item I'm currently contracted to acquire. You're not going to give it to me. No. So I'd be terminating a contract without delivery. You'd be terminating a contract with an ideological client in a way that, if handled correctly, communicates to the market that you made a rational decision rather than a breach. The brigade doesn't publicize its failed operations. They have too much interest in their operators' continued reputation to burn it on a visible dispute. He thought about this for a long time. Issei waited, without filling the silence, which was something he had learned was one of the more important skills in this kind of conversation. I need a transition period. 30 days to complete my current obligations, not including the item, and to stand down the team in a way that doesn't create problems for them. I can work with 30 days. And I need to understand what I'm walking into. The network. The clients. The risk profile. I'll give you a full briefing. After you've confirmed your decision, but before you've made any irreversible commitments. I trust the information won't be used against me because using it against me would cost you the opportunity. And the opportunity is worth more than anything you could give the brigade about my network that they don't already suspect. Another long pause. You think clearly, Voriel said. You're annoying in the way that people who think clearly are annoying. I've been told that before. I'll give you an answer in 3 days. 3 days is fine. They left the way station through different exits, which was a professional courtesy. 2.5 days later, Voriel sent a message through the same single-use channel. Yes. Start the transition. Issei filed this under the category he had created 3 months ago and had not yet needed, which was labeled, People Who Chose to Build Something Instead. Chapter 9, The Secretary. Historical Truth as a Personality. Corvinus was different from what he had expected. He had expected a bureaucrat who had become obsessed with a side project. What he found, when he eventually arranged the meeting through a route careful enough to protect them both, was something more unusual. A person who had organized their entire professional life around the maintenance of an ordinary-seeming position that gave them access to the documents they considered genuinely important. And who had been doing this for 11 years with a patience and consistency that Issei found both admirable and somewhat humbling. They met in Corvinus's private study in the mid-district residential sector, which was a room of approximately 15 feet by 12 that was so thoroughly occupied by shelves, documents, and the careful indexing system its owner had built over a decade that there was barely enough cleared space for 2 chairs and a small table. The room had the smell of paper and old magical residue, and the particular atmosphere of a space where a single focused mind had been working for a very long time. Corvinus was in his late 80s by devil reckoning, which placed him in early middle age. He had the slightly distracted quality of someone who was always, at some level of their attention, thinking about something other than the immediate conversation. But the distraction was not absence. It was more like operating on two channels simultaneously, with the immediate one receiving genuine engagement, and the background one running a continuous process that would surface when it became relevant. "You know about my private research," he said, when the initial pleasantries were complete. The pleasantries had been Issei's deliberate choice. Corvinus was not someone who would respond well to being approached as a transaction. "I know about your private research. I know you've spent 11 years building a documentary record of the Underworld's founding period that you believe corrects a systematic misrepresentation in the official history. And you're here because? Because I have an asset that I believe is relevant to your work, and I don't yet know what to do with it, and I think you might be the person who can help me understand it well enough to make that decision." He watched this land. The background channel in Corvinus's attention surfaced visibly, the distracted quality sharpening into something much more direct. "What kind of asset?" "Something that may contain primary source material from the founding period." "Not a document." "Something older and more direct than a document." The silence that followed had the quality of a held breath. "The custodians," Corvinus said quietly, as though the word itself was something he had been careful with for a long time. Issei was careful not to react with the full extent of his surprise. "Tell me what you know about them." What Corvinus knew was extensive. He had spent 5 years of his 11-year project specifically on the question of the custodians, working from fragments in secondary sources, indirect references in official documents, and one primary source that he had located in an archive that had been classified for 200 years and access to a process he declined to describe in detail. His understanding was this. The custodians of the unmade record had been a small organization of record keepers who existed before the current power structure of the Underworld was formalized. They had been present at the foundational negotiations, which had taken place over a period of approximately 30 years and had involved entities that no longer existed in their original form, species whose current descendants knew only partial versions of what had been agreed, and specific binding commitments that had been progressively erased from the official record as the parties who had made them found those commitments inconvenient. The custodians had documented everything. All of it. The real agreements, the actual terms, the specific commitments that had later been quietly renegotiated or simply pretended out of existence. And then, when it became clear that their documentation was going to make them targets for parties with strong interests in the official version of history, they had made a decision. They had committed the complete record to an object that could not be destroyed or accessed without the custodian key, and they had dissolved themselves as an organization, and the object had passed into storage. And the key had been divided into pieces that were distributed to entities the custodians trusted to hold them without understanding their purpose. And then, Corvinus said, the custodians died, and the people who held the key pieces died, and the generations after them didn't know what they were holding. The key pieces dispersed into the general artifact market over centuries. Some are traceable. Some are not. The object, Issei said. You believe you know what it is. I believe it's a memory vessel. An artifact capable of holding experiential record rather than written record. More complete than any document because it doesn't rely on language, which can be interpreted. It holds the actual experience of the decisions being made. He thought about Drake's words. It remembers a decision. If someone accessed it, he said carefully, what would they need? The key. Which is in pieces. I've located 2 of the pieces through my research, and I know the approximate provenance trails for 2 more. The 5th piece, he said, I haven't been able to locate at all. How many pieces total? 5. I've spent 7 years on this. Issei was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelves around him, the thousands of carefully indexed documents that represented 11 years of a single person's conviction. If I help you find the remaining pieces, he said, what happens when the vessel is opened? What do you do with what's in it? Corvinus looked at him steadily. I publish it. All of it. Not as leverage. Not as a commercial asset. as the historical record it is. That will be extremely disruptive to a number of powerful parties. Yes. And you're prepared for the consequences. I've been preparing for the consequences for 11 years. He thought about this. He thought about what he had said to Rainier. They're not incompatible things. I have the vessel, he said. The silence that followed was one of the longest he had experienced in a professional context. You have it, Corvinus said. The flatness of the statement was not skepticism. It was the quality of a person absorbing something that was too large to immediately process. Item 77. I've had it for approximately 3 weeks. I moved it when I became aware that 3 parties were pursuing it. 3 parties. The Chaos Brigade through a procurement contractor. Your office's administrative secretary as a private initiative. And an independent collector who appears to be connected to the brigade's contractor. Corvinus had gone very still. Corvinus, he said. You said my office's secretary? 3rd Administrative Secretary to the Undersecretary of Regional Commerce. Your colleague. Not you. I want to be precise about that. A long breath. We need to be very careful, Corvinus said. I know. That's why I came to you before doing anything with it. They sat in the room full of documents for another 2 hours, talking through what they each knew and what it implied and what the shape of a responsible decision might look like. When Issei left, the evening had moved into the deep amber of Underworld night, and the streets below were quiet. He walked for a while before returning to his building, in the way he did when he needed to let the shape of a new development settle before he started making plans around it. The vessel had been waiting 800 years. It could wait a little longer while he figured out how to open it without destroying everything he had built in the process. Chapter 10, Architecture. The network meets itself. He had been thinking for some time about how to make the network real to itself. The individual components were strong. The Goblin Syndicate provided logistics. Hyoudou provided artifact knowledge. Rainier provided intelligence. Milhita provided aerial observation. Tech provided the operational bridge to the syndicate. Vorio was transitioning in. Thessaly's advisory seat provided early warning from the forest territories. The Troll Confederacy contract was solidifying. Corvinus was now a parallel collaborator on the question of the vessel. But these components knew about each other only to the extent he had specifically told them about each other, which meant the network existed primarily in his head. If something happened to him, the network would fragment along the seams of its individual relationships, and most of it would dissolve. More immediately, the components were not helping each other because they didn't know where they could. He needed an architecture. He spent 3 days drawing it, literally, on a large sheet of paper pinned to the wall of his office. Not an organizational chart. Something more like a map of mutual dependencies, with lines connecting entities that had complementary needs, notations on where information flow between 2 components would benefit both without requiring him as the intermediary, and a set of core protocols that would allow the components to interact directly in ways that didn't compromise the security of his overall structure. When he was done, he looked at it for a while. Then he called a second full gathering, this one larger than the first briefing, himself, Rainier, Hyoudou, Tech, Milhita, and Vorio, who was 14 days into his transition and had already demonstrated in those 14 days that his reputation for procurement capability was if anything slightly undersold by the available evidence. He had not invited Corvinus to this gathering. Corvinus was a collaborator on a specific project, not a member of the commercial network, and mixing those contexts would have complicated both. He laid out the architecture on the conference table, this time as a set of documents rather than a wall drawing, with a copy for each person that they could annotate and return to him. This is what we are, he said. Not what I built. What we've built, each of you with your specific capability, and your specific reasons for being here. I want you to understand the whole shape of it because I think you'll be better at your parts if you can see how your parts fit. He walked them through it systematically. He covered the logistics layer, the intelligence layer, the artifact and weapons layer, the aerial observation layer, the procurement layer, and the advisory layer. He described the formal alliances and the informal ones and the places where the 2 categories overlapped. He described the 3 current threat assessments, and the status of each. He did not oversimplify and he did not soften the risk picture, because he had decided that a team that understood the risks was more resilient than one that had been protected from them. When he finished, there was a silence that had a different quality from the silences in most of his meetings. It was the silence of people processing something that was larger than they had individually understood it to be. Voriel spoke first. The shade problem. My former team's shade operative. Still active. I know where he bases out of. I know the sweep patterns he uses. If you want the information environment around the network hardened, I can give you the specific parameters you need to work around, Milhida said, and I can integrate that with the aerial observation protocol. If I know where his sweep edges are, I can position the observation posts in the gaps. He looked at the two of them. That was exactly what he had hoped for and had not been certain would happen organically in the first meeting. Good. Work out the details together and bring me the consolidated plan, Reyna said. Corvinus? He's not in the architecture document. He's a separate line. I'll brief you on it individually. A slight raise of her eyebrow that communicated a full sentence of reservation in a highly compressed format. Eubelina had been looking at the artifact and weapons layer with the particular quality of focused attention she used when she saw something that interested her professionally. The missing Phoenix archive items. The 43. She looked up. I've found 7 more of them. They didn't leave through the official dissolution. They were transferred to a private buyer through a channel that's been dormant ever since. The buyer's identity traces to a registered collector who died 40 years ago and whose estate was liquidated. Do we know where the estate assets went? Mostly dispersed through standard channels. But 3 lots from the estate were purchased by a single buyer who left no registered identity. I'm working on tracing the lot numbers forward. Keep at it. If those items include anything from the leverage point category, I want them in our possession before anyone else identifies them. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes. By the end of it, 6 specific cross-component projects had been initiated without his having to suggest them, because people who understood the whole architecture could see the connections themselves. After everyone had left, he sat alone with the architecture document and a pen and added a new layer to the diagram that he had not included in the version he had distributed. He labeled it Vessel and Key. He drew 5 nodes representing the key pieces, with their current known status annotated beside each one. 2 confirmed in Corvinus's possession. 2 with approximate provenance trails that needed to be followed. 1 unknown. He stared at the unknown node for a long time. Then he drew a line from it to a notation that read Drake? And wrote a question mark beside that too. He was not certain. But the chest had been in that warehouse for 800 years, and Drake had recognized something in it that he described as older than himself. And the boosted gear was old. Extraordinarily old. Old enough that its origins in the underworld predated the current power structure. He folded the private layer of the document and put it in the inner pocket of his coat, against his chest, next to the space where the boosted gear waited. You heard that, he said, to the presence inside the gauntlet. Yes, Drake said. Do you know? A long pause. The longest pause Drake had taken with him since the early months of their partnership, when there had been a great deal they were both figuring out. I don't know, Drake said at last. But I remember something that I could not have experienced, which suggests that the memory was placed in me rather than formed by me, and I have been carrying it for a very long time without understanding what it was. And now I think, Drake said slowly, that I may be part of something that began before I did. Which is a strange thing to consider. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the amber sky had deepened to its nighttime red, and the network's first full day of operating as an integrated architecture rather than a collection of individual agreements was ending with more open questions than closed ones. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this felt right. Chapter 11 The Key. 4 found, 1 to go. The first of the 2 provenance trails resolved in 12 days. It had led through 7 commercial transactions over 60 years, each one in a different sector of the underworld, each one involving the purchase of an estate lot that had been sold without specific item-level identification, which was a common practice in the mid-tier art and artifact market when the seller either did not know the value of individual items or was actively trying to avoid the documentation that identified them individually. The trail terminated at a private collector in the northern residential districts whose collection had been amassed over approximately 40 years and who was, according to Rayner's current intelligence, in a period of significant financial difficulty after a series of poor investments. He had sent Eubelina, not as a negotiator, as an appraiser. He had arranged an introduction through the mid-tier commercial exchange, presenting Eubelina as a specialist offering free appraisal consultations to private collectors, which was a real service with real value and also provided an entirely legitimate reason for someone with deep artifact knowledge to walk through a private collection and identify specific items. She had returned from the visit with an appraisal report that covered the collection's general contents, a quiet notation of the specific item she had identified as a probable key fragment, and a personal observation about the collector that she flagged as commercially relevant. The observation was, "He knows the collection is valuable but can't access that value without a buyer, and his financial difficulty is significant enough that the right offer would be seriously considered." He had constructed the offer carefully. It was for the entire collection rather than the specific item, which served two purposes. It prevented the collector from understanding which item was specifically valued, and it addressed the collector's financial situation more comprehensively than a single item sale would have. The price was above fair market value for the collection as a whole, which he could justify because the collection contained other items of genuine quality that would generate returns through Eubelina's artifact operation. The collector had accepted within a week. The key fragment was a small carved disc approximately the size of a large coin, made of a material that resisted standard magical analysis, and that Drake described as having a resonance similar to but distinct from the chest in the sub-basement, in the way that two instruments tuned to the same fundamental frequency but different overtones might share something essential, while sounding different in practice. He placed it in a sealed case and added it to the sub-basement storage unit, near but not touching the chest. Corvinus's reaction when he reported this was a silence of a different quality than his usual silences. The silence of someone who had been working towards something for 7 years and had just watched it get closer in a way that felt suddenly, vertiginously real. 3, Corvinus said. 2 I've had for years. Now 3. The second provenance trail is more complex. I have Voriel working on it. Voriel. The former brigade procurement operator. Yes. A pause. You trust him? I trust that his interests and mine are currently aligned and that he's professional enough not to betray a relationship that benefits him for the sake of a short-term gain. That's a more reliable basis than abstract trust. And the fifth key piece. I have a theory. I'm not ready to discuss it yet. Corvinus looked at him. The sacred gear. It was not a question. Corvinus had spent 11 years studying the founding period, and the founding period involved entities and objects of enormous age, and the boosted gear was among the oldest sacred gears in existence. I said I'm not ready to discuss it yet, he said. Understood, Corvinus said, with the discipline of a researcher who knew when to wait. What Voriel found? Voriel found the second key fragment in 11 days, which was faster than Issei had estimated and faster, he suspected, than Voriel had estimated either. The speed came from a combination of his procurement expertise and the intelligence infrastructure of the network, which he was still learning to use but was learning quickly, the particular quality of efficiency that characterized someone who had been operating with inferior resources for 15 years and understood immediately what was possible with better ones. The fragment had been in the possession of a border territory trading house that dealt in old lots from the dissolution of minor noble families. It had been listed in their catalog for years under a category called miscellaneous ritual components, unappraised, which was the category items ended up in when no one at the trading house had the expertise to identify them and they were valuable enough to keep but not specific enough to market actively. Voriel had purchased it as part of a larger lot through a trade identity he had maintained for years, which meant the purchase did not connect to Issei's network in any immediately traceable way. The total cost of the lot was moderate. He had resold the other components of the lot at a slight profit within 4 days through one of Eubelina's secondary channels. He delivered the fragment in person. It was a small curved piece, slightly larger than the first disc, made of the same unidentifiable material and carrying the same fundamental resonance with a different overtone pattern. When Issei held both fragments in his hands at once, With Drake's attention fully engaged, the resonance between them was faintly audible, a low tone at the edge of perception that was not quite sound and not quite silence. They recognize each other, Drake said, with a quality in his voice that was close to wonder. They'd been waiting to be near each other for a very long time. He placed the second fragment with the first in the sub-basement. 4 pieces. 1 unknown. He sat in front of the chest that evening with all 4 fragments arrayed beside it, and Drake's full attention engaged, and he waited. He did not try to open anything or test anything or analyze anything. He simply sat with it, the way he had learned to sit with problems that were larger than the tools he currently had. The chest hummed. It had always hummed. But the hum had changed in quality over the weeks since he had moved it here, had shifted from the compressed patience Drake had described when he first catalogued it in Warehouse 7 to something more like attention. Like something that was aware of what was happening around it, and was responding to that awareness with something that was not quite eagerness, and not quite urgency, but was recognizably oriented toward the future rather than simply enduring the present. He thought about Drake carrying a memory that was not his own. He thought about what it would mean for the 5th piece to be inside the boosted gear. The custodians had distributed the key pieces to entities they trusted, who would hold them without understanding their purpose. Drake was old enough. He had been carrying things across the centuries. And the founding period of the Underworld was precisely the era when the boosted gear had been created or at least first documented. He looked down at the gauntlet, which had manifested on his hand without his consciously summoning it, which happened sometimes when Drake's attention was fully engaged. When you said you were carrying a memory that was not yours, he said, was it like the other memories you have? The ones that are part of your nature? Drake was quiet for a long time. The tone from the 4 fragments shifted slightly, oriented. No, Drake said at last. It feels like it was given to me to hold. The way something important is given to someone trusted, with the expectation that the right moment will come to give it back. He looked at the chest. The chest was oriented toward him in whatever way an object without a face could be oriented. I think, he said, that you've been holding the 5th piece for 800 years. The tone from the fragments rose by a degree. I think, Drake said, very quietly, you may be right. Chapter 12. The weight of what was decided. The opening. He did not open the vessel immediately. The temptation was significant, and he acknowledged it to himself with the directness he tried to apply to his own internal states. It was sitting in front of him with 4 of its 5 keys in place, and the 5th apparently within reach, and the thing it contained had shaped the last 2 months of his life and sent 3 factions to their most careful operational positions and driven Corvinus to 11 years of patient archival work. The obvious move was to complete the key and open it, and understand what he had. He waited 3 days. The 3 days were productive. He used them to complete the Eastern Basin Contract's formal documentation, to review Milhita and Voriel's consolidated observation and hardening plan for the network's information environment, to send Grunder the revised technical specifications that incorporated the Confederacy's updated production standards, and to have a long conversation with Thessaly about the Northern Logging family's response to the boundary violation settlement, which was more complicated than he had anticipated and which revealed a secondary commercial dispute he had not known about, and which he was beginning to think might be worth addressing. He also, on the second of the 3 days, had a conversation with Rias. He drove to the Gremery estate in the late afternoon, which was an unusual time for a visit, and was received in the private sitting room that she used for conversations she did not want staffed. She was reading when he arrived and set the book down in the unhurried way of someone who was not surprised to see him, but was aware that the visit had weight. You've been busy, she said. Yes. Tell me. He told her most of it. He held back the specific location of the vessel and the specific identities of Corvinus and Voriel, not from distrust but from the genuine belief that limiting the information that could be extracted from any single person, including Rias, was a structural protection rather than a personal one. He told her about the Goblin Syndicate, the Troll Confederacy, the Harpy Observation Network, the Weapons Archive. He told her about the vessel and the custodians, and what the vessel was believed to contain. He told her about the 3 factions, and how he had managed each of them. She listened through all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things he had always valued about the way she listened. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, The founding agreements, she said. If they say what Corvinus believes they say, the power structure as currently constituted may rest on a version of history that is significantly different from what actually happened. That will create enormous disruption. Yes. Potentially. Depending on what it actually says? We don't know yet. She looked at the window. The Gremery estate grounds were carefully maintained outside, formal and green and very old. You built all of this in 16 months, she said. Not a question. A kind of accounting. Most of it in the last 8, he said. The first 8 were research. Issei. Yes. If what that vessel contains is what you think it contains. Are you prepared for what comes after? He had thought about this. He had thought about it a great deal. I'm not prepared for the specific shape of it because I don't know the specific shape yet. I'm prepared in the sense that I've built something resilient enough to withstand significant disruption. The network is valuable enough to enough parties that its destruction is commercially costly. That's not invulnerability. But it's a real foundation. And personally, he said, I think what's in that vessel should be known. Whatever it costs. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was the particular quality of attention she used when she was seeing something that she recognized and was glad to recognize. Then you should open it, she said. The gathering. He invited 4 people to the sub-basement on the 3rd evening. Corvinus, who had spent 11 years building toward this moment, and whose knowledge of what the vessel contained would be essential to understanding what it released. Rainier, because she was the intelligence operation and because the intelligence implications of what the vessel contained were going to require immediate assessment. Eubelina, because she was the artifact specialist and because the act of opening the vessel was an artifact event that he did not want to attempt without someone who understood what could go wrong with objects of this age and purpose. And Thessaly, because the Kirin's founding period involvement was something Corvinus had mentioned in passing during their research conversations, a fragment of evidence suggesting that the original negotiations had included non-devil species in ways the official history had entirely erased. She had come from the forest border that afternoon, traveling in her bipedal form, and she stood in the sub-basement with the particular stillness of someone who could feel the resonance from the chest and the fragments without needing them explained. You know what this is, he said to her, not as a question. She looked at the chest for a long time. We have stories, she said. Not in any form that your researchers would accept as evidence. But stories of the original negotiation. Of what was decided and then forgotten. Of the objects that were made to remember. Were your people at the negotiation? Our ancestors. Yes. He looked at Corvinus. Corvinus was looking at Thessaly with an expression of the particular quality of a researcher encountering a primary source they had not known existed. He thought of Drake, and of the memory that had been given to hold. He looked at the gauntlet, which had manifested again. Drake. If you're ready. Ready is an interesting word for this, Drake said. But yes. Eubelina had prepared the opening sequence from the research she and Corvinus had done together in the preceding week. The precise arrangement of the 4 physical fragments around the chest, the orientation relative to the chest's natural resonance axis, the sequence in which the 5th element would be introduced. She directed the placement of the fragments with the focused calm of a professional operating at the edge of their expertise. When the 4 fragments were in place, the resonance in the sub-basement changed. It filled the air in the way that sound fills a room but was not exactly sound, a deep sustained presence that was less like hearing and more like the awareness that something significant was paying attention. The chest's hum intensified. Now, Eubelina said quietly. He held out the gauntlet. He did not will the boosted gear to act. He simply opened his awareness to the possibility that it would, and held the connection between himself and Drake fully present, the way he had learned to stand in the center of the gear's power rather than being carried by it. Something moved. Not physically. Not in the sub-basement's air or light or temperature. Something in the informational layer beneath the physical, in the space where Drake's presence lived and where the memory that was not his own had been waiting, shifted. Released. Oriented toward the 4 fragments like a current finding the sea. The chest's hum became a tone. The tone became something that was not quite language and not quite music but occupied the register where both lived, a sustained complex expression that carried, in a way that bypassed the ears and arrived in the mind directly, the experience of a room. Issei stood in the sub-basement, and simultaneously stood in a room he had never been in, 800 years ago, in a negotiation that had lasted 3 decades, and he understood what had been decided. It took a very long time. Subjectively. Objectively, perhaps 30 minutes. When it ended, the sub-basement was very quiet. He looked at the others. Corvinus was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, not in distress but in the posture of someone overwhelmed by the confirmation of something they had devoted their life to. Rainier was standing very still with an expression he had never seen on her before, something that was not her professional composure and not her personal caution, but something older and less armored. Eubelina had one hand on the wall. Thessaly was looking at him. "You heard it," he said. "Yes," she said. "Everything my people's story said was true." He stood with this for a moment. The vessel had shown him the full record of the original negotiations. The actual agreements. The genuine commitments that had been made by every major power of the founding era, including commitments made on behalf of species whose descendants now had no idea those commitments existed. Including rights that had been formally granted and then quietly erased. Including a specific agreement about the nature of the Underworld's governance structure that was so different from the current arrangement that publishing it would not simply disrupt the existing power hierarchy but fundamentally delegitimize its constitutional basis. He thought about what he had said to Rias. "I think what's in that vessel should be known. Whatever it costs." He had meant it. He still meant it. But he stood in the sub-basement with 4 people who had just experienced the same thing he had experienced, and he understood that whatever he did next was going to define the enterprise he had built in ways that a logistics contract or a weapons acquisition never could. He was not just a merchant anymore. He had not been just a merchant for some time, probably, but now he could not pretend otherwise. He was someone who knew what had actually been decided. And he had a network resilient enough to survive what came after. Almost. He looked at Corvinus. "We need to make copies before we discuss next steps." "Everything. Multiple secure locations. The record does not get lost again." Corvinus raised his head from his hands. His eyes were bright. "I've been prepared for that for 11 years, he said. Issei looked at the chest, which was silent now, its hum stilled for the first time since he had known about it. Not because it was empty. Because it had delivered what it held and was resting in the completed state of a thing that had finally done what it was made to do. 800 years of patience. He understood, in that moment, something he had not fully articulated even to himself. The network, all of it, the goblins and the trolls and the harpies and the Kirin and the weapons archive and the intelligence operation, had been built for exactly this. Not consciously. Not by design. But because the only entity that could safely hold what this vessel contained and navigate what its publication would cause was something large enough, complex enough, and commercially indispensable enough that destroying it was not a rational option for any of the parties who would most want it destroyed. He had built his protection before he knew exactly what he was protecting. He picked up his coat. He looked at each person in the room. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to tell the truth." He left the sub-basement and walked out into the underworld night, and the amber sky above the lower districts held the first real edge of something that was going to change, though no one watching from a window would have been able to say quite how or quite when. He was 19 years old. He had a network and a truth and 800 years of someone else's patience working as a kind of inheritance in his favor. He had a great deal of work to do,